Price is what you pay. Value is what you get. What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Alex here from Team Generations, back again with another video. So today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. This is actually a list of what I believe to be the best competitive value within Vanguard. With the introduction of Overdress and the D series, I think we're going to basically bring in a lot of different players that might not have been in Vanguard previously. So a video like this is good for somebody just starting out, maybe looking for a budget deck that won't just straight up get rolled by the meta. If you are looking back to V Premium, you want to get engaged in that format as well. This is a really good starting point. A lot of these decks on this list do not cost more than $50. I don't think there's a single deck that really goes above that. That's obviously current market prices. I can't really speak to future too much, but there are some decks that are well under that, and I believe will remain there as well. So whether you're a veteran player just looking for a really great value maybe to get back into the game, or you're a brand new player looking to experience V Premium along with the D series that you've already gotten into, I feel like this is going to be a good list for you. So without further ado, let's hop right in. So I think before we even get into some of these decks, I just have to mention one thing. So something that I think is a little bit more prevalent in maybe Yu-Gi-Oh! And to an extent, I guess Magic, but these decks, they're largely considered like rogue decks. I know the term doesn't really exist the same way within Vanguard, but you have like an inherent advantage in a lot of different matchups if you're not playing against the right type of player, because not everybody knows how to play against these decks. They're not the most popular in the world, and I feel like you can catch a lot of people off guard, so you have just that inherent kind of advantage against a lot of different players. And if you are an excellent pilot with this deck, I feel like you can actually have really great results with pretty much any of these decks. So without further ado, no more talking, let's hop right into the list. Alright, hopping right in with number 9. We're starting off with my personal favorite Protect clan. This is going to be Granblue, and I'm of course talking about the 7 Seas archetype. So within 7 Seas, you have a really fun multi-attack strategy that relies off of a pretty cool marker generation called like treasure markers. You're basically trying to attack your opponent and hit absolutely anything on their field, and you basically generate these markers on your circles. Now, the more markers you have, the more advantage you're going to get off of your main Vanguard, 7 Seas Night Mist. So very, very effective card overall. I think that this strategy is a little bit underrated. I think out in the East and Japan and stuff, when this deck first came out, there were some very good competitive results for it. And I think as time went on, people just kind of gravitate towards new shiny toys. They want different cards. I still think that this deck has a lot of life within it, and I think that not a lot of people are used to playing this deck, so I think that you can sneak those wins off of an unsuspecting player, which is something that kind of all the decks on this list more or less share. So I think that this deck still is very competitive and makes use of Protect 2 in an aggressive way, gives you that aggressive playstyle that you don't typically get within Protect, and I also think the artwork is just really cool, and it provides almost like an upgrade path. Like you can kind of take some of your cards, put them into different Granblue decks if you really wanted to as well. So I think the deck in a whole is still pretty competitive, and I think that if you're talking about like a budget value list, this deck definitely has to be on there. Coming in at number 8 is actually a pretty unique clan. We're talking about Angel Feather and of course Nociel. Nociel is actually another pretty aggressive Protect 2 kind of deck. Not always Protect 2, but another deck that definitely can utilize it and just kind of strays away from the typical Protect kind of, oh, I'm going to turtle for a bit, be defensive. This deck is all aggro, all go. Now, I know you also might be scratching your head, but wait, a lot of the builds have the grade 1 Searcher and also the grade 2 coming out of Divine Lightning Radiance. You don't need those cards in this deck. The deck is so aggressive on its own, you don't have extra circles that you really want to fill with those, so I don't believe you need that grade 2. And you also filter so much from your damage zone that the grade 1 Searcher is definitely not necessary. So that right there, I mean, those 2 cards alone, probably around $50. So taking those out, I know that the grade 3 Vanguard is probably around that $3 to $5 range, but if you find them for a good deal, the rest of the deck is pennies. It really is like a $10 the rest of the core. So, and I'm not sure what happened to the end of the video there, but it did kind of get chopped off. I don't know how, but anyway, in summary, Nociel is actually a really cool strategy because you are riding onto a grade 3, you're riding another grade 3 from hand thereafter, and you could potentially restand one of the rear guards or 2 of them of the rear guards that already attacked that turn. So you're generating 2 Protect markers, getting that multi-attack off, and you're really cherry picking and just manipulating your drop zone in order to get these really powerful front row units with a grade 0 that is included in the deck. Pretty unique to Nociel in general. So very nice deck. I think for the value, I mean, you are not paying a lot at all for this deck, and it could stand up to a lot of different meta decks right now and just really have like an unorthodox play style that people aren't necessarily used to. So again, you will have that like kind of rogue advantage there as well. So let's move right along. Coming in at number 7, this is actually a clan that I have not featured on the channel before. We will be having a deck profile for this deck, so stay tuned for that. Subscribe maybe if you want to stick around and get notified for that. But this is actually going to be for Aqua Force. This is Valeos. So like I said, Valeos is brand new out of Clan Selection Volume 2, and it hasn't really established itself in the market quite yet, but I believe if Clan Selection Volume 1 is any indication of what the prices will do, I believe they'll remain relatively low. Valeos in general is a really cool strategy because what you're doing with it is basically taking your opponent's Vanguard, subtracting 5k power, so even if they're on a grade 3 Vanguard, your grade 1s can hit, and your grade 1s can hit because your defensive triggers that your opponent hits do not activate during your turn. So you can swing, they hit a defensive trigger, and boom. Typically in Excel, you're kind of done after that. That was like the big hang up with a lot of Excel clans for a while, but no longer is that an issue. And on top of that, Valeos swaps units in between rows. There's a lot of just restanding units in general, so you're blitzing your opponent, very aggressive overall, and you can recur resources from the drop zone with its one of its skills as well. So I believe this deck is actually very underrated and will definitely be a very competitive deck. We're starting to get to the point where I would feel comfortable taking this deck and above on this list to a regional event if I'm really passionate about the clan, and I don't want to maybe drop a lot of money on some other different clans that might be like the tier 1A. I think that this is a very, very good option, and so are all the ones past it on this point. Moving into number 6, this is actually one of my personal favorite decks, period. Not really a clan that I'm very big on, but I'm actually ironically talking about Great Nature Big Belly. Big Belly's whole mechanic is that you can essentially restand your entire field if you have a grade 3 in your soul. A lot of the other units as well just really power themselves up, so you are restanding very, very, very powerful units on your first grade 3 turn with the help of a support card. And honestly, in this deck, I think that support card is probably the most expensive. I think it's somewhere around like $5 to $7 right now, but once you purchase that, everything else is very, very cheap within the deck. I think you can definitely get this deck for right around that $50 mark, if not under by just a little bit, give or take maybe $5, but very effective. You're hitting like almost late game force-like numbers on your very first Vanguard ride. You are just leaving your opponent, if they even survive your first grade 3 turn, in pretty much like an impoverished hand state, and just gonna have a really bad turn after that. So especially if they've been on grade 2 first. If you like big powerful units, you're into that animal kind of aesthetic, I think that this deck is seriously so slept on. If you're sitting here scratching your head, oh, that's not a great deck, I haven't seen the top, I encourage you, just try this deck, play it. If your friend has it, just dig it out from somewhere. We also featured this deck on a deck profile on the channel, so go check that out. My build is a little bit high rolly, like you definitely need to have that support grade 3 card, but once you see that, if the deck goes off, I mean, it goes off to a crazy extent, and in the right hands, I think that this deck can blitz people out of nowhere and do something that nobody expects. So I definitely think at number 6, this is a very competitive deck, and you definitely should not be sleeping on it. Moving into top 5, a clan that we have featured here time and time again on the channel, I am of course talking about Tachikaze. Now, we are going to be looking more so at the Gaia archetype and the Gigano Blazer. I don't really know which one to call it, but combined, I think they have a very, very nice strategy overall. You are multi-attacking a ton. This deck really focuses around riding into Gigano Blazer and then into Gaia on your second grade 3 turn. Basically, you're just generating a ton of resources, cherry picking what you want potentially from the drop with a new support card that lets you recur some resources, and the main thing really is retiring your rear guards for a multi-attack. Once your rear guards get retired in this deck, they basically come back out again, and then you get another multi-attack off of that, and both of our Vanguards do power up the front row, one of them only if you have an equip gauge on that unit, but chances are in this deck you are spamming those equip gauges like crazy. There's nothing in this deck, maybe outside of the grade 1, the grade 3 Searcher. I think everything else in the deck is very, very budget. Multiple things have been reprinted so many different times, and I really think that this deck is a sleeper. This takes people by surprise when I play it right now. People just don't know the exact attack pattern I'm going to go after. You don't even know the attack pattern sometimes too, because you can't look at some of your equip gauges, but this is an extremely, extremely powerful deck. I think that you can take anybody in the meta down right now. I don't think that this, will just auto lose to absolutely anybody. If you are a good pilot with this deck, I mean, you can really take it far. I'm talking regional success, whatever you want. Just make sure you practice, log a lot of games on this, because the attack order is a little bit different. So definitely take some experience in playing this deck to nail. Coming in at number 4 now, this is actually kind of a surprise pick. I haven't really featured too much of this stuff on the channel before, but this is actually going to be Nightmare Dolls for Pale Moon. Now, with the addition of Chelsea, we are basically addressing a big power issue that we had previously, where if your opponent hit a defensive trigger, your turn was kind of shut off and you just ran out of juice in general. But Chelsea now gives an additional 10k to 2 rear guards that pop out of your soul, so very effective in that regard. You're basically rewriting for another marker generation, just typical Pale Moon shenanigans, popping things into your soul, popping out, just multi-attacking. Very difficult for your opponent to know your attack pattern. I think that the ceiling is really high with this deck. I think the floor is pretty low too if you don't know how to pilot it correctly, but if you log quite a few games on this, I think that with a little bit of practice, you can bring this deck really far. I think results are starting to support that now as well. So very interesting clan, very fun. I would definitely say that this is, if you like a combo deck, a lot of like, Yu-Gi-Oh, in, out, blah, 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 I think that this deck is really, really fun and might be for you. Coming in at number 3, I surprised myself with this one. I really, really did, but I think it's too competitive not to include in the top 3. We're going to be talking about Bang Dream, actually. Hello Happy World, more specifically. I don't know if it was the ratios in the boxes or the sets, whatever it was, but this card is extremely cheap. The whole entire deck you can probably pick up outside of the draw PGs for, I want to say, like less than $7. It really is that cheap. Hello Happy World basically revolves around playing a music card just like the other archetypes within Bang Dream, but you actually call a body to board in order to call that music card to your rear guard circle, so it's a little bit more of a deck thin in that regard. On top of that too, I mean, you are doing crazy multi-attack bouncing. You are basically sitting there, if you're someone who plays Pokemon or whatever, like you like that sequencing, this deck is awesome for that. You are popping cards up, down, back, here again, gaining power, here, there. I mean, you can get off reliably like 5 attacks per turn, if not even more, potentially more. So you're on those nice force numbers. This deck is so cheap, and I think that not a lot of people know how to play against it in the West. I feel like, obviously we got this set late. I feel like the little razzle-dazzle just kind of wore off for us and nobody was really interested. So these cards are extremely cheap right now. I think the draw PG is probably like $6-7, but if you're willing to pay that and then pay the other $7, you can have a really, like a top tier meta contender for like $30. This deck is really crazy. I encourage you to try it before you start crapping on it or saying, oh, this is definitely not a meta deck. So try it out. I think value wise, this is one of the best decks you can pick up right now. Moving into number 2, if you told me this would have been a budget or value clan back in like 2019, I would have laughed in your face. I am actually talking about Bermuda Triangle for number 2. I'm going to be talking about Anj and Prism. They are tied at number 2. Now, both of these decks could be talked about separately, which I do believe they are best when they're not really combined. I don't like combining a lot of the Bermuda sets, but these decks, are just so insanely competitive for such a crazy value. You're talking like dollar Vanguards and so much potential throughout the deck. Now, I know Prism right now will have a card released in Volume 2 that could potentially be a little bit more, but you can honestly play the deck without that. I think that in Japan, we're seeing a lot of people play with it, and if it does end up being pretty cheap out of Clan Selection Volume 2, you can slot it in no problem, but the deck operates absolutely fine outside of it. Prism is all about binding cards, recalling them for nice, powerful numbers, gaining resources off of them, just a really nice multi-attack engine, and of course, you are on a force number, so it does make it very competitive as well in that regard, both defensively and offensively. Makes it a little bit harder for your opponent. Anj is my personal favorite of the two there. Actually, probably is my favorite Bermuda deck outside of Pacifica, just, for fun reasons, Pacifica though. But Anj offers an awesome strategy where you can pop cards from your side of the field, your opponent's side of the field. Based on how many cards you return to hand, you get different benefits off of them. You get another force marker, you get to call a card from your deck, and give your Vanguard an additional power boost. So this is a whole lot going on for just a counterblast and retiring and recurring some of your resources to hand and potentially getting rid of some of your opponent's tricky stuff as well. The moment of truth, the number 1 on our list. I don't know if you guys have guessed it already, but this is a deck that I have featured multiple times on the channel before, even very recently. This is a deck that I've always preached is probably the best value in Vanguard for competitiveness. This is, of course, Murakuma. I am going to go with Yasui as number 1. Yasui, when it was first revealed, was absolutely dumped on. People did not like it. They thought it was a terrible card, but I think when it came out, people definitely turned around on it and realized, oh, this is actually a good card. Now, the value on this card is astronomical. It's just a couple, I think it's like $1 maybe for the Vanguard. The triple rares aren't very expensive at all either. You can do everything in this deck. This deck can pace itself with the best decks of the meta. You can re-ride generating multiple Excel circles. You can swing with large powerful attacks for your Yasui Tenmas, pop something on your opponent's field, so a little bit of removal, as well as soul generation and of that possible re-ride that I mentioned before. Running Shiryuki in the deck, you can run two different types. I know the original one is a little bit more expensive, in the build that I'm probably referring to here is definitely like the newer Shiryuki included in it, but that is still not a bad thing at all. The original one allowed you to push offensively. This one allows you to survive a little bit longer and is especially good for a force meta for the new Shiryuki, the grade 3 out of clan selection volume 1. This allows you to Soul Blast 2, and you basically get a 30k guard off of that now. That's really helpful for Hamiel and other things that just swing with impossible power that may guard restrict you as well. I think that for the value that this deck is, like the cost is absolutely next to nothing. You can get value out of Nyudo with drawing, you can get defensive out of Shiryuki, you can get multi-attacks in this deck. When you re-ride that Yasui Tenma, you have spot removal, and you just have an overall very pressure presence kind of deck. I think that this deck paces really well and does all of the other things that I mentioned on that list very, very well as well. Murakumo in general is probably just the best value clan. Like I mentioned, I think that Hugo, when it first came out, was amazing. It's still a really good card. You can do some interesting plays with the new Shiryuki. You can do, obviously include the old one as well. You can go and play Dueling Dragons even. I think that not a lot of decks can keep up with the lock of Dueling Dragons. If you get off that successful turn, I mean, you're in control of that game still. So those kind of cards that just have not game-breaking abilities, but just timeless abilities, I think that are so good, and you'll never see them truly go away. So no matter what way you want to take your Murakumo deck, I feel like you have so many different options. Yasui probably is the best one, but if you find a better value in one of the other ones, definitely try them out too. Murakumo is number one, with Yasui being that number 1A. Moving into our honorable mentions, so like I said, there are just a couple cards in these decks that currently prevent it from being on the list due to pricing that probably are just a little bit too much, or just, there's like a support card that's older that you definitely need and you can't really run the deck without it. So that's the reason they didn't make this list, but I'm going to start off number 1 actually with Agravane. So Agravane is only a couple dollars now. It's basically a gold paladin strategy. You suck in all your rear guards after you attacked and call the same amount from the top of your deck as you called for that turn. Now the only problem with this is I feel like every single gold paladin deck right now to run to a competitive level, you need Percival, and Percival needs Aglavale, and it's just a really expensive card right now, so I cannot recommend that. On top of that, you kind of need Gorviduk as well, so I think overall it's just too expensive to kind of say that it's budget or anything. But again, with those 1 or 2 cards kind of tweaked, maybe they come out reprinted in the future, I think that Agravane could have made this list. It is a very, very cheap Vanguard that I still really enjoy the strategy to today. Next up on our list, it's kind of going to be like a combo because they both run into the same problem. This is Victor and Blouse. So Victor and Blouse, at least the main core of Blouse used to be cheap. Now I think the triple rare is pretty expensive. Correct me if I'm wrong. They just kind of need those old support cards, so Kick Typhoon, the Hank card, the grade 2, also the grade 1 Searcher, Arashad is pretty expensive for it, so those kind of things are needed for both of those decks. Otherwise, the deck is pretty inexpensive. I do have some budget options for the Blau deck as well. You can go check that out on the channel. I'll link that in the description, but overall, I think that it is just too expensive to include on this list, but they are very competitive decks, and I wish I could have included it if some of their older support maybe was reprinted. The next deck here really killed me not to include it. I'm going to mention Budget Eradicators, actually. So out of Divine Lightning Radiance, we received a couple cards. The Eradicator card that essentially stands, you restand twice on your turn, potentially twice on your turn, so a total of 3 Vanguard attacks, but the main problem is you need Gauntlet Buster. Gauntlet Buster is expensive. It's just an older card out of Aerial Steed Liberation. I think they go for like almost $30 now, so really, really awesome card overall. I think that if you have the right mindset while playing that deck, you can be very competitive with it, outlast, outgrind, and just outshine a lot of your opponents. But The secondary version of it, I think, with the grade 3 that came out of Divine Lightning Radiance, I forgot the name off the top of my head, is not a bad deck to run with. You don't need Cho-Oh for it. You don't really need the grade 3 searcher. I know that they were cheap when they were reprinted, but right now they are pretty expensive, so just a couple cards just prohibiting it from being on this list. But overall, if you wanted to play a little bit of a cheaper version of it, you can definitely go for that. The next one on this list is kind of weird because I feel like so many of the cards in it are just very cheap overall, aside from the grade 1 searchers, and that's really making me just not include it on this list. I'm actually talking about Sanctuary Guard Dragon. If you wanted to, you can go pick up the common versions of Sanct Guard for like, I think they're like less than $1. They're really, really cheap. But it's just that you need Silicus in the deck, or Sisilus, I forgot how to say his name, but the grade 1 searcher is very expensive. They had an alternate art reprinting for it. If you're willing to spring for that, I feel like the rest of the deck is pretty cheap. I don't know how much the new Royal Paladins are going to be out of Clan Selection Volume 2, but those complement the deck very well, so I think that restanding Vanguard on Sanctuary Guard Dragon is just really, really powerful. It gets beefed up by its rear guards. It's just a very effective strategy overall, and I definitely like it. It hurts me to not put it on this list, but it's just that grade 1 searcher is a little prohibitive, so I'm not including it on this list. The last deck that I think is pretty much budget overall and might not be too budget, don't know the prices 1000% off the top of my head, but it's actually Harry for Pale Moon. So this is a really cool strategy, kind of focusing on a stage. You're basically stacking Force 1, I would say most of the time, Excel 1 markers on a single, basically extended rearguard circle or an extra rearguard circle, and you're putting your dragon on that, trying to close out the games that way. I think that this deck still is competitive, and if you love Pale Moon, if you're a good Pale Moon player, you can definitely pilot it to a lot of success. I just think that the grade 1 searcher, I think, is a little bit expensive for it. I think that it just isn't as competitive as Nightmare Dolls. Like, Nightmare Dolls is probably the best Pale Moon deck at the moment, even though Silver Thorns is still pretty decent. All the Pale Moon decks are actually pretty good. End of Stage is still pretty competitive as well. And that is going to wrap up our list for today, so thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys have a deck that you think I missed, let me know in the comments down below. Let me know what you think the best competitive value deck really is. Let me know what you would recommend to a friend kind of getting into Vanguard or somebody kind of returning. I'm definitely interested to know, like I said. But this is Alex from Team Generations signing out.